So we're finally going to see this paper tiger start to burn in the flames. Joe Biden, I don't think, is really cut out to be a long-distance runner in the 2020 Democratic race. That's my opinion. I don't think I'm the only one who thinks so. And the fact is that the reason that Joe Biden continues to be the front runner right now is because so few of his opponents are able to set themselves apart and present themselves as a real alternative. And there's so many stories that are coming out right now about not only the weakness of Joe Biden, but the weakness of the people who are the so-called alternative choices to him. So you could have, for example, here, 3 candidates are being urged to drop out of the race. Some of these people, you might not even know their names. First of all, there's Beto. Beto is being told to drop out so that he can run for Senate because John Cornyn is running in Texas for re-election, and I don't even know if he's going to end up running for re-election, but he could end up, even if he retires, it would be a good seat for Beto to run for, but for the fact that now he's sort of a joke all over the country. So I think that, the strength that he built when he was running in 2018 against Ted Cruz has largely been squandered with this ridiculous this run for the White House. So anybody who he runs against in 2020 will be able to point his finger back at him and say, look, you thought, based on a failed campaign that you ran in 2018, that you could run for the White House. You failed catastrophically, and now you think you can crawl back here and try to represent this state? I don't think so. The other 2 that are being considered are John Hickenlooper of Colorado and Montana's Steve Bullock. I don't know if either of those would be a great candidate. I know that once you lose catastrophically in a presidential race, you kind of look ridiculous. I know for a fact that that's the way it looks here for John Kasich, who ran in 2016 for president, and he only won in Ohio, which I guess is better than nothing. But nobody considers John Kasich anymore to be a serious presidential contender, except for maybe John Kasich and the people at CNN. So yeah, there's a lot of people who are pretty miffed that there's so many candidates still in the race, and they're going to be eventually, I guess, mollified in the winter, because once the Iowa caucuses are over, and probably even before that, a number of these people are simply going to have to drop out because they won't have any donors. There's going to be a lack of money. People don't bet on a losing horse. That's something that politicians know. They may not know it when they're trying to get you to vote for them at first, but they quickly process it when it comes time to actually pay for buses and airfare and whatever. Unless you're independently wealthy, it's not worth it to run a major campaign. Now for Joe Biden, this is a story that came out about a week ago. I didn't really cover it at the time because I was a little busy. But this is from News One, which is a quote-unquote black news source, but whatever. They said that Joe Biden has reportedly lied for decades about marching in the civil rights movement. Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders might have elicited groans from one audience when he recently repeated his oft-cited line that he marched with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but at least he was telling the truth. A new report claims that former Vice President Joe Biden has been holding a big lead atop the Democratic presidential polls since he announced his candidacy in April, has repeatedly and knowingly lied about his involvement in the civil rights movement. Despite advisors reminding him of the truth, Biden has kept telling the story anyway, according to a damning report from the New York Times' Matt Flegenheimer. There's actually video of him doing this. That's pretty crazy.
When I marched in the civil rights movement, I marched with tens of thousands of others to change attitudes.
But he never actually marched in the civil rights movement at all.
So that's hilarious. And the Democrats, I think, were hoping that someone like Joe Biden. I don't think Joe Biden would have been their first choice. So I'm going to explain what's going on here. He wouldn't have been their first choice because the fact is that the Joe Biden of old, the pre-2008 Joe Biden, was just another of many senators that were not particularly great. Here's another story of him telling black voters to quote, reject Jesse Jackson. He said, you must reject the voices in this movement who tell black Americans to go it alone. And he said this at the NAACP's 1986 convention in Baltimore. The two men, both in their mid-40s, were preparing to run for president, and they were in the middle of a deep and enduring argument about Democratic politics. Biden wanted to build consensus. Jackson wanted to build a movement. Biden's decision to lash out to his left, now forgotten by pretty much everyone but Jackson himself, offers a glimpse of instincts and positioning that have changed little, even as he has shifted his thinking at times to stay within the mainstream of his party. We must reject the voices in my party who say, and you've heard it time and again, much progress has been made, and now we must wait for the Reagan Revolution to run its course. Biden told the mostly black audience that day in Baltimore, easing into his criticism of Jackson. But just as I and many other white leaders reject the voices of those who are calling for caution, he continued, you must reject the voices in this movement who tell black Americans to go it alone, who tell you that coalitions don't work anymore, that whites and Catholics and Jews no longer care about the problems of black America, that only blacks should represent blacks. So I want people to understand that the fact is that Jesse Jackson in the 80s was considered the leftward fringe of the Democratic Party, but he was bringing new interest into the party from young people, from minorities. Jesse Jackson in the 80s would have been considered the Bernie Sanders of his time. The fact is that Jesse Jackson is a hustler and a crook, and he's victimized his own community much more than he's helped them. And the organization that he runs, the Rainbow Push Coalition, they are more useful in getting white collar jobs for very fancy black executives than they are about helping poorer Americans. Or they're not really an organization that's out there to help the lower class black community or the lower class minorities that they claim to be. But back in the 80s, they were considered to be the cutting edge of it. And even Sanders endorsed Jackson in 1988. So this idea that Joe Biden is some paragon of coexistence with black America is a relatively new thing. This isn't to say that he's the most racist Democratic politician that there's ever been, but he's always been a fence sitter when it comes to race relations. He was always somebody who was trying to appeal to the white working class vote when he could, while not really stepping on anyone's toes in the black community. But in this case, he was stepping on somebody's toes. He was stepping on Jesse Jackson's toes. So this is something that I think is going to come up again and again during the campaign. Not just the Jackson thing, but the issue of lying about his civil rights record. And when you look at what's going on with the nomination race, yes, Biden has an advantage technically of 16 points over Bernie Sanders. But I think that the 17% that are voting for Bernie Sanders are people who really want to vote for Bernie Sanders. Even if you don't, like me, I hate Bernie Sanders, but I can acknowledge that people are actually enthusiastic if they're planning on voting for him. I don't really believe that when I hear about Joe Biden. I hear when I hear people say that Joe Biden is the front runner, what I see is that there are a lot of people who simply are, they're wandering around and they're treading water in the ocean, and they'll just grasp onto any old person that will come by, and the piece of driftwood happens to be Joe Biden, and that piece of driftwood isn't a ship. It's just a piece of driftwood, and eventually you have to find real safe, some sort of safety there. And some of these other candidates, I think, they also have paper candidacies. Beto, for example, I think is really a complete joke. Booker, de Blasio, you have Klobuchar. Some of these people, you wonder exactly why anyone is even mentioning them. You have, let's go through exactly what's going to happen when Biden's support really, really begins to crumble. It's already beginning to crumble, I believe. I think some of these polls are just a joke. In the latest poll, Biden only has 27% support. The prior poll from The Hill had him at 35%. So he's dipping under 30% for the first time just last week. Now, again, the aggregate works a little differently. This is something that most savvy political commentators tell you. So you don't take this with a little grain of salt. We'll wait till the next poll. But I see Biden trending downward, and eventually that trend is going to get sharper. And there's a few factors that I think are contributing to this. First of all, there is the reality that his actual record and the way he's being packaged don't really match. There's two different Joe Bidens. There's a Joe Biden of the marketing, and then there's the Joe Biden that actually existed in the Senate for over, 30 years? 36 years, I think was the exact number. And then there's the fact that he's older and he's not as fast on his heels as he was. People were saying when he got into the race, people on the Republican side were saying, "Oh, you have to watch out. He was better than Paul Ryan in the debate in 2012." Look, first of all, that's not that impressive of an accomplishment if you think about it. And second of all, it's been 7 years since then, and it's going to be 8 years once if he is to face Donald Trump on a debate stage. And Joe Biden has clearly lost a step. You can hear his speech is slower. He seems to be much less sure of himself. He's taking more and more direction from his staff rather than telling them what he thinks. He's basically a puppet candidate. There's no Joe Biden really working up there. It's the Joe Biden is really something that's a part of the messaging. That's why he has mainly some of these cutout clowns like Simone Sanders working for him that don't really have any true vision. They're just latching on to people based on their image. And once Joe Biden, I think, collapses, which I think will happen. Look, if I'm wrong, I'm going to be wrong. I'm sorry. I can't give you opinions that are based on things that I don't think, but I do think that Joe Biden is going to collapse. And the people who latched onto his campaign, people like Simone Sanders, I think are going to commit career suicide by being associated with him. I mean, I could be wrong. Basically, what could happen is that a lot of these people might jump ship and get jobs with other campaigns. But I think Joe Biden is going to have a lot of very embarrassing moments on the way down. Who stands to benefit? So first of all, before people jump on me, yeah, I think Bernie Sanders will benefit from Joe Biden's weakness, but it's not really going to be just him. You're certainly going to see some of his support flow to Kamala Harris and possibly Pete Buttigieg. The people who are lower down in the polling, I have no clue what is going to be needed in order to bring them back up. So you have the Iowa polling, and Biden is still leading Sanders by 8 points. I think eventually you're going to see a three-way battle between Biden and Sanders and possibly Elizabeth Warren. Pete Buttigieg, I'm not sure what to make of him. So yeah, you could possibly throw him in. The rest of the people in the race, I'm sorry to say, just are not really making an impact yet. I would like to see Andrew Yang and Tulsi Gabbard get more attention, but they simply aren't. And for those of you that haven't seen it, I think Yang gave an excellent interview to Dave Rubin on Friday, but I don't think you really get victories in primaries or anything by going on Dave Rubin. It just isn't enough. It's not enough yet. So That's about it. I think that this paper tiger is finally beginning to fall apart. The Joe Biden candidacy will eventually just fade away, and somebody's going to gain that ground. I think Kamala Harris has the most to gain at the moment, but there's other people as well. Talk to you guys later. Have a great Tuesday, and also please subscribe to me on Minds, on BitChute, and on Subscribestar. My screen name on all three of those is @ChefLeopard. And also on Gab, my screen name there is Starscream85. I'll talk to you later.